They found her in the East Wing 3 days after the flood, a young widow with an infant pressed to her chest, standing beside a man whose title could have crushed her reputation with a single word. But when the rescue party broke through the castle doors, what they discovered wasn't scandal, it was something far more dangerous to the established order: equality. In those 72 hours of isolation, class distinctions had dissolved like sugar in rain, and what emerged would shake the foundations of Regency society itself. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. Eleanor Ashford had learned to measure her life in obligations rather than desires. At 23, widowed for 8 months, she existed in that peculiar social purgatory reserved for young women whose husbands had the poor grace to die before securing their futures. Her late husband, Thomas Ashford, had been a respectable solicitor, respectable enough to marry a gentleman's daughter fallen on reduced circumstances, but not wealthy enough to leave her anything beyond a modest cottage in Hampshire and their son, William, now 6 months old and the entire universe contained in 10 pounds of squirming humanity. The morning of the flood had begun unremarkably. Eleanor had accepted the position of temporary companion to Lady Hartwell, a distant connection of her mother's family who maintained a sprawling estate in the Yorkshire Dales. The arrangement was meant to last through the summer, providing Eleanor with a small income and, more importantly, a respectable roof over her head while she determined her future. Lady Hartwell, elderly and increasingly frail, required little beyond someone to read to her in the afternoons and manage her correspondence. Hartwell Castle itself was a magnificent anachronism, a medieval fortress that had been expanded and modernized over centuries until it sprawled across the hillside like a stone organism, all turrets and wings, connected by corridors that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The East Wing, where Eleanor had been given modest rooms, dated from the Tudor period, with narrow windows that looked out over the valley and walls thick enough to muffle the world outside. She had been in the nursery that morning, coaxing William through his feeding, when the housekeeper, Mrs. Dalton, had appeared with news that sent a flutter of anxiety through the household staff. His Grace, the Duke of Thornbury, had arrived unexpectedly, seeking shelter from the storm that had been building since dawn. The Duke was a distant cousin of Lady Hartwell's late husband, and while he had every right to use the castle as a way station during his travels, his presence transformed the atmosphere entirely. Eleanor had heard of the Duke of Thornbury, of course. Everyone had. At 31, Adrian Blackwood was one of the most eligible and elusive men in England, a man of considerable wealth and impeccable lineage, who had thus far resisted every matrimonial scheme launched in his direction. He was said to be intelligent, reserved, and possessed of a dry wit that could fillet pretension with surgical precision. He was also rumoured to be impossibly particular, a man who found the marriage market beneath his dignity and the young women paraded before him uniformly tedious. "Keep to the East Wing," Mrs. Dalton had advised, her tone suggesting this was less guidance than commandment. "His Grace will be in the main house. Lady Hartwell is indisposed, so he'll likely remain only until the weather clears." Eleanor had no intention of crossing paths with a duke. Her position was precarious enough without drawing the attention of someone who could, with a word, influence her prospects or lack thereof. She was the widow of a solicitor, a woman of genteel birth but no fortune, caring for an infant in borrowed rooms. The last thing she needed was to become visible to someone of Thornbury's consequence. But the storm had other plans. By midday, the rain that had been falling steadily since morning transformed into a deluge of biblical proportions. The river that ran through the valley, normally a placid ribbon of water, swelled into a roaring torrent that consumed its banks and reached hungrily toward the castle. Eleanor watched from her window as the water rose, first covering the lower gardens, then the courtyard, then lapping at the foundations of the building itself. The castle staff moved with increasing urgency. Furniture was hauled to upper floors. Valuables were secured. And then, as the afternoon light began to fail, the water breached the ground floor of the main house. Mrs. Dalton appeared at Eleanor's door, her face pale. "The bridge is gone," she said without preamble. "The main house is flooding. We're evacuating everyone to the higher wings, but the east wing—" She hesitated. "The east wing is cut off. The connecting corridor is underwater." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. Cut off? The water rose faster than anyone anticipated. The Duke was in the library in the east wing when it happened. He'd gone there for some papers. Now he's trapped on this side, same as you. Mrs. Dalton's expression was grim. "We'll get you out as soon as the water recedes, but for now you'll need to stay put. There's food in the kitchenette on the second floor, and the rooms are dry. You'll be safe enough. Safe, perhaps. But alone in a medieval wing of a castle with a duke and her infant son cut off from the rest of the household." Eleanor's mind raced through the social implications, each more disastrous than the last. "Mrs. Dalton, surely there's another way." "There isn't, Mrs. Ashford. I'm sorry. Keep to your rooms if you prefer, but you should know His Grace is aware of the situation. He's asked that I assure you he'll maintain appropriate distance." The housekeeper's tone softened slightly. "He's a gentleman, Mrs. Ashford. You needn't fear for your reputation." But Eleanor did fear, not because she doubted the Duke's honor, but because she understood how the world worked. Reputation wasn't about truth, it was about appearance. And the appearance of a young widow trapped alone with an unmarried duke, regardless of circumstances, was precisely the sort of thing that could destroy what little standing she had left. After Mrs. Dalton departed, Eleanor stood at the window, watching the water continue to rise, and felt the walls of her golden cage, the careful respectability she'd maintained since Thomas's death, begin to close in. She had no choice but to wait, to endure, and to pray that when the flood receded, her reputation would remain intact. William stirred in his cradle, making the small mewling sounds that preceded a full cry. Eleanor lifted him, pressing her cheek to his downy head, and whispered, "It's just us now, little one. We'll weather this storm as we've weathered everything else, together and without complaint." But even as she spoke the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that the flood had washed away more than just bridges and gardens. In the silence of the East Wing, with the Duke somewhere in the corridors beyond her door, Eleanor Ashford stood at the threshold of a transformation she couldn't yet name, holding her son and wondering what the receding waters would reveal. The first 24 hours passed in careful avoidance. Eleanor remained in her rooms, venturing out only to access the small kitchenette on the second floor, where Mrs. Dalton had assured her she'd find provisions. She moved quietly, listening for any sound that might indicate the Duke's presence, determined to maintain the fiction that they were not, in fact, trapped in the same wing of an isolated castle. William, blessedly, seemed unaware of the social catastrophe unfolding around him. He ate, slept, and demanded attention with the cheerful tyranny of infancy, providing Eleanor with both distraction and purpose. She told herself that if she could simply wait out the flood without encountering the Duke, she might emerge from this ordeal with her reputation intact. But on the second morning, as she made her way to the kitchenette with William balanced on her hip, she rounded a corner and came face to face with Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Thornbury. He was taller than she'd expected, with dark hair that looked as though he'd been running his fingers through it, and grey eyes that held an expression of mild surprise. He was dressed informally, no cravat, his shirt open at the collar, and carried a stack of books under one arm. For a moment they simply stared at each other, two people caught in a situation neither had chosen. "Mrs. Ashford, I presume," he said finally, his voice a pleasant baritone with an undertone of dry amusement. "I apologize for startling you. I was under the impression you'd be keeping to your rooms." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. I am. I only came for—" She gestured helplessly toward the kitchenette. "Food? Yes, of course." He shifted the books to his other arm. I've been doing the same. The provisions are adequate, though I confess I'm developing a profound appreciation for Mrs. Dalton's foresight in stocking tinned goods. He paused, his gaze dropping to William, who was studying the Duke with the solemn intensity of a very young philosopher. Your son? Yes. William. Eleanor adjusted her hold on the baby, suddenly acutely aware of how she must appear. Hair hastily pinned, dress wrinkled from sleeping in a chair, a widow with an infant in a situation that would fuel gossip for months. The Duke seemed to sense her discomfort. Mrs. Ashford, I want to assure you that I have no intention of compromising your situation further. I know how this must appear, and I regret that circumstances have placed you in such an awkward position. I propose we maintain a polite distance and speak of this to no one once we're rescued. Your reputation will remain intact. It was a generous offer, delivered with the casual authority of someone who had never had to worry about reputation because his was unassailable. Eleanor should have felt grateful. Instead, she felt a flicker of something uncomfortably close to resentment. That's very kind of you, Your Grace, she said, keeping her tone carefully neutral. I appreciate your discretion. He nodded, as if the matter were settled, and moved to step past her. But William, with the impeccable timing of the very young, chose that moment to let out a wail of displeasure. Eleanor jostled him, trying to soothe him, but the cry only intensified. The Duke paused. Is he unwell? No, just he's hungry and I need to prepare his feeding, but... She broke off, flustered. The kitchenette was small, barely large enough for one person, let alone two adults attempting to maintain proper distance while one prepared an infant's meal. Allow me to help, the Duke said, setting down his books. I'm reasonably competent at following instructions, and it seems inefficient for you to struggle while I stand by uselessly. Eleanor wanted to refuse, to maintain the careful boundaries they'd just established. But William's cries were escalating, and pride seemed a poor substitute for practicality. If you're certain, entirely certain, tell me what you need. What followed was a strangely domestic interlude that would have been unremarkable in any other context but felt surreal given their respective positions. Eleanor directed, and the Duke, a man who commanded estates and influenced Parliament, measured water and warmed milk with the focused attention of someone tackling an unfamiliar but intellectually interesting problem. William, appeased by the promise of food, quieted to watchful whimpering. You're quite good at this, Eleanor observed, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. The Duke glanced up, a hint of amusement in his expression. I spent several years on the continent after university. One learns to be self-sufficient when traveling, though I confess infant feeding is a new frontier. He handed her the prepared bottle. Will that suffice? Perfectly. Thank you, Your Grace. She settled into a chair to feed William, expecting the Duke to take his leave now that the crisis was resolved. But he lingered, leaning against the doorframe with an expression of thoughtful curiosity. How old is he? 6 months. And your husband? Died 8 months ago. Fever. Eleanor kept her tone matter of fact. She'd learned that sympathy, while well-intentioned, often made grief harder to bear. I'm sorry. The Duke's condolences were simple, without the performative pity she'd come to dread. It must be difficult, managing alone. One manages. Eleanor looked down at William, who was feeding contentedly, his small hand curled around her finger. One has little choice. The Duke was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted, become less formal. Mrs. Ashford, I realize this situation is far from ideal, but since we're trapped here together, perhaps we might dispense with some of the more absurd conventions? I have no intention of compromising you, and I suspect you have no designs on compromising me. Could we not simply coexist? Civilly? Eleanor looked up, startled by the directness of the proposal. In her experience, men of the Duke's rank didn't suggest dispensing with conventions. They were the conventions, walking embodiments of social hierarchy. But there was something in his expression, a weariness perhaps, or a hint of genuine curiosity, that made her reconsider her automatic refusal. What exactly are you proposing, Your Grace? That we acknowledge the absurdity of pretending the other doesn't exist while trapped in the same wing of a castle? That we share meals, if you're comfortable doing so, and perhaps conversation? I've been alone with my thoughts for 2 days, and I'm beginning to find my own company tedious. He smiled slightly. I promised to be on my best behavior. It was madness, of course. Every rule of propriety screamed against it, but Eleanor was tired of rules that protected reputation while ignoring reality, tired of performing respectability for an audience that would judge her regardless, tired of being alone. Very well, she heard herself say. Civility. But if this becomes known, it won't. You have my word. And so, an unlikely truce was formed in a flooded castle, between a duke who was tired of pretense and a widow who had nothing left to lose but a reputation already hanging by a thread. Neither could have predicted where that truce would lead, or how the walls they'd built around themselves would begin to crumble in the days to come. That evening, they shared a simple meal in the small dining room adjacent to the kitchenette. The Duke proved to be an engaging conversationalist, asking Eleanor about her life before widowhood, her thoughts on the books she'd been reading to Lady Hartwell, her opinions on matters he might have dismissed had she been a woman of his own class. And Eleanor, to her surprise, found herself responding with a candor she hadn't exercised in months, perhaps years. It was only later, after she'd returned to her rooms and settled William for the night, that Eleanor allowed herself to acknowledge the danger she'd walked into. Not the danger of scandal. That was already present, unavoidable, but the danger of connection, of seeing a man of impossible rank as simply a man, intelligent and unexpectedly kind, who looked at her as though her thoughts mattered. She stood at the window, watching the floodwaters that still surrounded the castle, and wondered what would happen when they finally receded. Would the Duke return to his world and she to hers, as though these days had never happened? Or had something shifted between them, something that couldn't be washed away as easily as mud and debris? Outside, the rain continued to fall, and Eleanor Ashford, who had learned to expect nothing from life beyond survival, felt the first dangerous stirrings of hope. On the third morning, Eleanor woke to silence. The rain had stopped. She rose quickly, careful not to disturb William, and went to the window. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind a landscape transformed, mud-slicked grounds, debris scattered across what had been manicured lawns, and in the distance the broken remnants of the bridge that had connected the estate to the outside world. They would be rescued soon. The thought should have brought relief, but instead Eleanor felt an unexpected pang of loss. The past 2 days, strange as they had also been oddly liberating. In the isolation of the East Wing, she had been simply Eleanor, not the poor widow, not the dependent relation, not the woman whose every action was scrutinized for propriety. She had been herself, in conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts, rather than her circumstances. The Duke had been equally surprising. Beneath the reserve and the aristocratic bearing, Adrian Blackwood was a man of considerable intellect and unexpected humor. He had opinions on everything from agricultural reform to the novels of Miss Austen, and he seemed to delight in debate, encouraging Eleanor to challenge his positions rather than simply agreeing out of deference to his rank. Last night, after William had been settled, they had talked until late, the conversation ranging from the philosophical to the absurd. At one point, the Duke had asked her what she would do if circumstances were different, if she had the freedom to choose her own path. "I would study," Eleanor had said without hesitation. "Medicine, perhaps, or natural philosophy. I would want to understand how things work, to contribute something beyond mere existence." The Duke had looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That's a remarkably ambitious answer, Mrs. Ashford. Is it wrong to be ambitious?" "Not at all. It's simply rare to hear a woman speak so plainly about it." He had leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intent. "What stops you?" Eleanor had laughed, a sound without humour. "Everything, Your Grace. I'm a widow with an infant and no fortune. My ambitions are irrelevant. My reality is finding a way to survive respectably until William is old enough to make his own way in the world. And if survival weren't the primary concern, if you had means, but I don't. Hypothetically, Eleanor had considered the question seriously, allowing herself the dangerous luxury of imagining a different life. I would go to London. I would find a way to attend lectures, to access libraries, to learn from people who know more than I do. I would make myself useful in some way that mattered. She had met his gaze directly. But that's fantasy, Your Grace. My life is here, in borrowed rooms, reading to elderly ladies, and hoping my son will have opportunities I never did. The Duke had been quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor had wondered if she'd overstepped, revealed too much of the bitterness she usually kept carefully hidden. But when he spoke, his tone was thoughtful rather than judgmental. I think you underestimate yourself, Mrs. Ashford, and I think the world is poorer for wasting intelligence simply because it happens to reside in someone without fortune or the correct surname. It had been one of the kindest things anyone had said to her in years, and Eleanor had gone to bed that night, feeling seen in a way she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, perhaps not even then, if she were being honest. Thomas had been a good man, but he had never asked her what she wanted beyond the conventional markers of feminine contentment. Now, watching the floodwaters recede, Eleanor knew that the rescue she'd been waiting for would also mean the end of this strange interlude. The Duke would return to his life of consequence and privilege. She would return to her precarious position as Lady Hartwell's companion, and they would both pretend these 3 days had never happened. She was preparing William's morning feeding when she heard a knock at her door. The Duke stood in the corridor, dressed more formally than he had been the previous days, his expression unreadable. "They've managed to rig a temporary crossing," he said without preamble. "The household staff will be able to reach us within the hour. I wanted to inform you before they arrived." "I see. Thank you, Your Grace." He hesitated, as though weighing his words. "Mrs. Ashford, I want you to know that I've valued our conversations these past days. It's been refreshing to speak with someone who doesn't treat every word I utter as though it were handed down from on high." Eleanor managed a small smile. "I suspect you'll have no shortage of sycophants once you return to London, Your Grace." "Undoubtedly, which is precisely why I find them so tedious." He paused again, and Eleanor had the sense that he was building towards something, some statement or question that required more courage than their previous conversations. "Mrs. Ashford, I wonder if I might ask you something rather forward." "You may ask, though I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." The Duke's expression was serious now, almost intense. "What if your circumstances could change? What if you had the opportunity to pursue those ambitions you spoke of last night?" Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat faster, though she couldn't have said why. "I don't understand, Your Grace. I have a sister, Catherine. She's 25, unmarried by choice, and currently living in London, where she's involved in various reform efforts, education for working-class children, improved conditions for women in factories, that sort of thing. She's brilliant, stubborn, and perpetually in need of intelligent assistance. I think you would suit each other admirably. Your Grace, Hear me out, please." The Duke stepped closer, his tone urgent now. "Catherine has been looking for a companion, someone who can help manage her correspondence, research, and various projects. It would be a paid position, with rooms in her townhouse in Bloomsbury. You would have access to her library, which is extensive, and through her connections you could attend lectures and meet people engaged in serious intellectual work. It would be respectable employment, Mrs. Ashford, but it would also be an opportunity." Eleanor stared at him, unable to process what he was offering. "Why would you do this? You barely know me." "I know enough. I know you're intelligent, capable, and wasted in your current position. I know my sister would benefit from your assistance, and you would benefit from the opportunities her world could provide." His expression softened slightly. "And perhaps I'm tired of watching talented people suffocate under the weight of circumstances they didn't choose." Consider it an act of enlightened self-interest. I'm helping my sister while simultaneously ensuring that at least one person of genuine intelligence escapes the tedium of provincial life. It was too much, too sudden. Eleanor's mind raced through the implications, the risks, the sheer impossibility of what he was suggesting. Your Grace, I have a child. Your sister might not. Catherine adores children. She'll be delighted. And before you raise another objection, the position includes a small salary and accommodation suitable for you and William. You would be independent, Mrs. Ashford. Not wealthy, but independent. Independent. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering with possibility. Eleanor had been dependent her entire life, first on her father, then on Thomas, now on the charity of distant relations. The idea of independence, of choosing her own path, was so foreign it felt almost dangerous. "I need time to think," she said finally. "Of course, but Mrs. Ashford?" The Duke's grey eyes held hers. "Don't let fear of change keep you in a cage, even a comfortable one. You're capable of far more than survival." Before she could respond, they heard voices from below. The rescue party had arrived. The Duke stepped back, his expression returning to its usual reserve, the mask of aristocratic distance sliding back into place. "I'll have my secretary contact you with the details, should you decide to accept. Take your time, but don't take too long. Opportunities have a way of vanishing if one hesitates." He turned and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing in the doorway with William in her arms and her carefully ordered world tilting on its axis. Below she could hear Mrs. Dalton's voice, efficient and brisk, organizing the evacuation of the East Wing. Soon she would be back in her small rooms, back in her role as the grateful dependent, the respectable widow who asked for nothing and expected less. But something had changed in those 3 days of isolation. The Duke had shown her a glimpse of a different life, had treated her as an equal rather than a charity case, and had offered her something she'd thought lost forever: choice. Eleanor looked down at William, who gazed back at her with solemn blue eyes, and made a decision that would alter both their futures. She would accept the Duke's offer. She would go to London, work for his sister, and carve out a life that was hers by design rather than by default. The floodwaters had receded, but Eleanor Ashford was no longer the same woman who had watched them rise. She had been offered a lifeline, and she intended to grasp it with both hands. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the drawing room of Catherine Blackwood's Bloomsbury townhouse, adjusting the sleeve of a dress that still felt foreign despite having worn it for 3 months. The gown was elegant, but understated, a deep blue silk that Catherine had insisted she needed for proper London society, though the society Catherine moved in bore little resemblance to the rigid hierarchies Eleanor had known in Hampshire. Catherine herself was a revelation, tall, dark-haired like her brother, with the same grey eyes but a more animated expression. She spoke rapidly, moved with purpose, and had opinions on everything from women's suffrage to the latest developments in medical science. Her townhouse was perpetually filled with reformers, intellectuals, artists, and the occasional scandalous figure whose ideas were too radical for more conventional drawing rooms. Eleanor had adapted to this new world with a speed that surprised her. Her role as Catherine's assistant had quickly evolved into something more collaborative. She managed correspondence with various reform organizations, researched legislative proposals, and helped draft pamphlets on education reform. She attended lectures at the Royal Institution, visited schools in the East End, and found herself in conversations with people who valued her mind rather than her connections. William, now over a year old and beginning to walk, thrived in the chaotic warmth of Catherine's household. The staff adored him, Catherine spoiled him shamelessly, and Eleanor had the luxury of pursuing her work while knowing her son was safe and loved. It was, in every measurable way, the life she had imagined during those conversations with the Duke in the flooded castle. And yet, there was an absence she couldn't quite name, a sense that something remained unfinished. She had seen the Duke only twice since arriving in London. once, briefly, when he had called to ensure she was settling in adequately. The second time at a dinner Catherine had hosted, where he had been polite but distant, treating Eleanor with the same courteous formality he extended to all his sister's guests. Eleanor had told herself this was appropriate, even necessary. Whatever connection they had formed during those 3 days had been a product of extraordinary circumstances. In the real world, dukes and widowed companions occupied different spheres, and it was foolish to imagine otherwise. But tonight was different. Tonight, Catherine was hosting a salon to discuss a proposal for expanding educational opportunities for working-class girls, and the Duke had agreed to attend. More significantly, Lord Pemberton would be there, a powerful member of Parliament whose support could make or break the initiative. "You'll present the financial analysis," Catherine had told Eleanor that morning. "Pemberton respects numbers, and your research is impeccable. Adrian will handle the political maneuvering, but you'll provide the substance." Eleanor had spent weeks preparing the analysis, examining costs, projected outcomes, and funding models. She knew the material thoroughly, but the prospect of presenting it to a room full of influential people, including the Duke, made her uncharacteristically nervous. The guests began arriving at 8. Eleanor recognized several faces from previous gatherings: Dr. Margaret Hartley, a physician who ran a clinic for poor women; Thomas Ashford, no relation to her late husband, an education reformer; and several members of Parliament known for progressive views. And then, precisely at 8:30, the Duke arrived. He was dressed impeccably in black evening wear, his dark hair swept back, his expression composed. But when his gaze found Eleanor across the room, something flickered in those grey eyes, recognition perhaps, or something more complex. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, approaching with Catherine, "my sister tells me you've been instrumental in developing tonight's proposal. I look forward to hearing your analysis." "Thank you, Your Grace. I hope it proves useful." "I'm certain it will." His tone was formal, but there was warmth beneath it, a suggestion of the easier rapport they had once shared. The evening proceeded with the structured informality characteristic of Catherine's gatherings. Dinner was served, conversation flowed, and then, as coffee was brought in, Catherine called the room to attention. "We're here tonight to discuss a proposal that could change the lives of thousands of girls currently denied access to education," she began, her voice clear and passionate. "Mrs. Ashford has conducted extensive research on the financial and practical aspects of establishing a network of schools in London's working-class neighbourhoods. I'll let her present the findings." Eleanor stood, her heart pounding, acutely aware of every eye in the room turning toward her. She had spoken in public before. Catherine had ensured she had plenty of practice, but never to an audience of this consequence. She began with the numbers, laying out costs and funding models with the precision she'd honed over months of work. But as she spoke, she found her confidence growing. This wasn't about her. It was about the hundreds of girls who deserved the opportunities she'd been denied. The children who could become doctors, scientists, writers, if only someone gave them the chance. "The question isn't whether we can afford to do this," she concluded, meeting Lord Pemberton's skeptical gaze directly. "The question is whether we can afford not to. Every girl denied education is potential wasted, contribution lost. The cost of ignorance is far higher than the cost of enlightenment." There was a moment of silence, and then Dr. Hartley began to applaud. Others joined in, and Eleanor felt a flush of triumph mixed with relief. Lord Pemberton leaned back in his chair, studying her with new interest. "That was quite persuasive, Mrs. Ashford. You've clearly done your homework." "Mrs. Ashford does nothing by halves," the Duke interjected smoothly. "It's one of her more admirable qualities." The comment was innocuous enough, but something in his tone made several guests glance between them with curiosity. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks and quickly returned to her seat. The discussion continued for another hour, with various guests offering suggestions, objections, and modifications to the proposal. The Duke navigated the political complexities with practiced skill, building consensus and neutralizing opposition. But Eleanor noticed that he frequently deferred to her expertise, asking her opinion on practical matters and ensuring her voice remained central to the conversation. It was only as the evening was winding down that the moment Eleanor had been half dreading, half anticipating finally arrived. She was in the library gathering papers when the Duke entered. "That was impressive tonight," he said without preamble. "You've come into your own, Mrs. Ashford. I had an excellent opportunity, Your Grace, thanks to you." "Thanks to you? I merely opened a door. You walked through it." He moved closer, his expression serious. "I wanted to apologize for my distance these past months. I thought it best to maintain formality, to avoid any suggestion of impropriety that might complicate your position here." "I understand, Your Grace. It was the appropriate course." "Was it?" He studied her intently. "Because I find I'm tired of appropriate, Mrs. Ashford. I'm tired of pretending that those 3 days in the castle were merely an amusing interlude, easily forgotten. I'm tired of treating you like a stranger when you're one of the few people in London whose company I genuinely value." Eleanor's breath caught. "Your Grace, I don't think—" "Adrian. My name is Adrian. And I think we've moved beyond titles, don't you? That's not— we can't—" Eleanor struggled to find words for the impossibility of what he seemed to be suggesting. "You're a duke. I'm your sister's employee. The difference in our positions is irrelevant to me. Has been since the moment we had that first real conversation in a flooded castle." He took another step closer, close enough that Eleanor could see the intensity in his eyes. "I'm not proposing anything scandalous, Eleanor. I'm simply asking if we might be friends. Real friends, not the polite acquaintances we've been pretending to be." "Friends," Eleanor repeated, testing the word. "To start with, yes. Beyond that—" He smiled slightly. "Beyond that, I suppose we'll see. But I'm tired of distance, and I'm tired of pretending. Life is too short and too uncertain to waste on propriety that serves no one." Eleanor knew she should refuse, should maintain the careful boundaries that protected both their reputations. But she was tired too, tired of caution, tired of denying the connection that had formed between them, tired of living as though happiness was something that happened to other people. "Friends, then," she said finally. "But Adrian—" She used his name deliberately, feeling the intimacy of it. "If this becomes complicated, then we'll handle complications as they arise, together." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Eleanor took it. The handshake was formal, but the look they exchanged was anything but. In that moment, standing in Catherine's library with the sounds of departing guests filtering through the door, Eleanor felt the last of her carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. She had come to London seeking independence and opportunity. She hadn't expected to find connection or the possibility of something more. But life, she was learning, had a way of surprising you, especially when you finally stopped trying to control every outcome and simply allowed yourself to live. Spring arrived in London with a riot of blossoms in the parks and a renewed energy in Catherine's household. The education proposal had gained momentum, with Lord Pemberton's cautious support evolving into active advocacy. Eleanor found herself increasingly involved in the practical implementation, visiting potential school sites, interviewing teachers, and managing the complex logistics of turning vision into reality. But it was her evolving friendship with Adrian that truly transformed her life. True to his word, he had abandoned the formal distance that had characterized their early months in London. He called regularly at the townhouse, ostensibly to discuss the education project with Catherine, but inevitably ending up in long conversations with Eleanor about everything from political philosophy to the latest scientific discoveries. They attended lectures together, walked in Hyde Park with William toddling between them, and engaged in the kind of intellectual sparring that Eleanor had craved her entire life. Adrian challenged her assumptions, encouraged her ambitions, and treated her as an equal in a way that felt revolutionary. The ton naturally noticed. Whispers began to circulate about the Duke of Thornbury's frequent visits to his sister's unconventional household, about the widowed companion who seemed to have captured his attention, about the possibility of an attachment that defied every social convention. Catherine, when Eleanor expressed concern about the gossip, had merely laughed. Let them talk. Adrian has never cared about society's opinion, and neither should you. Besides, the scandal will die down once they realize there's nothing improper occurring, just two intelligent people who enjoy each other's company. But it was more than enjoyment, and Eleanor knew it. Somewhere between the debates and the walks and the quiet moments, when Adrian would look at her with an expression that made her heart race, friendship had deepened into something neither of them had explicitly acknowledged, but both clearly felt. The turning point came on an unseasonably warm April evening. Catherine was hosting a small dinner for the core group working on the education project, and Adrian had stayed late after the other guests departed. They were in the garden, watching William chase fireflies with the determined concentration of a toddler on a mission. "He's grown so much," Adrian observed, smiling as William stumbled and picked himself up without complaint. "He has your determination." "And his father's stubbornness," Eleanor added, though she spoke without the sadness that had once accompanied any mention of Thomas. She had loved her husband, but it had been a comfortable affection, nothing like the intensity of what she felt for the man standing beside her. "Eleanor," Adrian said, his tone shifting to something more serious, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you respond." Eleanor's heart began to pound. "All right. These past months have been the happiest I can remember, not because of the work, though that's been fulfilling, but because of you. Because of our conversations, our debates, the way you challenge me to think differently about everything." He turned to face her fully. "I know the obstacles. I know that society will have opinions about a duke marrying a widow of modest means. I know that there will be those who question your motives and my judgment, but Eleanor, I don't care. I want to marry you, not because it's convenient or appropriate, but because I cannot imagine my life without you in it." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "Adrian, I'm not finished," he smiled slightly. "I want you to know that this isn't about rescuing you or elevating your position. You don't need rescuing. You've proven that thoroughly. This is about two people who have found something rare and valuable, and who are brave enough to claim it despite the obstacles. So, Eleanor Ashford, will you marry me?" There were 1,000 reasons to refuse. The difference in their ranks, the gossip it would generate, the potential damage to Adrian's political influence, the suggestion that she had schemed her way into a duchess's coronet. Eleanor could hear every objection society would raise, every whisper that would follow them, but she could also hear Catherine's voice. Let them talk. She could remember the woman she had been in that flooded castle, trapped by circumstances and expectations, and the woman she had become, someone who pursued her ambitions, who contributed meaningfully to work she believed in, who had learned that happiness was worth fighting for. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Adrian's expression transformed into pure joy. He pulled her into his arms, and Eleanor felt the last of her reservations dissolve. This was right. Complicated, certainly. Unconventional, absolutely. But right in a way that transcended social convention. William, oblivious to the momentous decision being made, toddled over and demanded to be picked up. Adrian obliged, lifting the boy with easy affection. And Eleanor felt her heart swell at the sight of them together, her son and the man who would become his stepfather, who had never once treated William as an inconvenience or complication. "We'll face the gossip together," Adrian said. William balanced on his hip. "And we'll prove them all wrong, not by defending ourselves, but by living well and doing work that matters." "Catherine will be insufferable," Eleanor observed, laughing through her tears. "She'll claim she orchestrated the entire thing. She'll certainly try, but we both know the truth. This was orchestrated by a flood and fate, and we were wise enough not to fight it. The deal, the announcement of their engagement, created exactly the scandal Eleanor had anticipated. The newspapers were full of speculation about the Duke of Thornbury's surprising choice of bride. Some praised his progressive values, others questioned whether the widow had manipulated her way into his affections. Eleanor's background was dissected, her late husband's modest profession noted, her position in Catherine's household examined for evidence of scheming. But Eleanor, supported by Adrian and Catherine, weathered the storm with a dignity that gradually won over even the skeptics. She continued her work on the education project, refusing to retreat into the protected obscurity that some suggested would be more appropriate for a future duchess. She attended lectures, spoke at meetings, and demonstrated through her actions that she was marrying Adrian not for his title, but despite it. The wedding was planned for June, a small ceremony at Adrian's estate in Derbyshire. Eleanor insisted on simplicity, wanting the focus to be on their commitment rather than the spectacle. Catherine, naturally, had other ideas, but compromises were reached. As the wedding approached, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here, from the desperate widow in a flooded castle to a woman about to marry a duke, not as a fairy tale ending, but as the beginning of a partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The night before they were to leave for Derbyshire, Eleanor stood in the nursery, watching William sleep. Adrian found her there, slipping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Second thoughts," he murmured. "Not even first thoughts," Eleanor replied. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. A year ago, I was trapped in every sense, by circumstances, by expectations, by my own fear of hoping for more. And now you're about to become a duchess and gain a husband who will undoubtedly irritate you with his opinions on agricultural reform." Eleanor laughed softly. "I'm looking forward to being irritated. It means I'm alive, engaged, part of something real." "And we both are," Adrian said. "And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." As they stood there in the quiet nursery, with William sleeping peacefully and their future stretching before them full of possibility and challenge, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for being rescued, but for being given the chance to rescue herself, and for finding someone who understood the difference. The flood had washed away her old life, but in its place she had built something stronger, something chosen, and that, she thought, was the truest kind of freedom. 18 months after the wedding, Eleanor stood in the drawing room of Thornbury Hall, the Duke's ancestral estate in Derbyshire, reviewing correspondence related to the network of schools that had become her life's work. The first 3 schools were operational, serving over 200 girls, and plans were underway for 5 more. The project had expanded beyond anyone's initial expectations, gaining support from unexpected quarters and transforming from a radical proposal into a model that other reformers were beginning to emulate. Outside, she could hear William's delighted laughter as he played in the gardens with Adrian. Her son was nearly 3 now, bright and curious, calling Adrian Papa with an ease that never failed to move Eleanor. Adrian had formally adopted William shortly after their marriage, ensuring the boy would have every advantage and protection the Thornbury name could provide. But more than that, Adrian had become a true father to William, patient, engaged, and genuinely delighted by the boy's endless questions and observations. Watching them together, Eleanor often thought about how different William's life would have been if she had remained in Hampshire, trapped in genteel poverty and limited expectations. Now he would grow up in a household that valued education and curiosity, with opportunities she could never have imagined providing on her own. The door opened and Catherine entered, carrying a stack of papers and wearing the expression of barely contained excitement that usually preceded one of her new schemes. "I've had a letter from Dr. Hartley," Catherine announced without preamble. "She's been approached by a group of women physicians who want to establish a teaching hospital specifically for training female doctors. They need funding, political support, and someone to manage the organizational aspects. Eleanor set down her own correspondence, already anticipating where this was leading. And you think we should be involved? I think we must be involved. This is exactly the kind of initiative that could transform women's access to medical education. Catherine's eyes gleamed with enthusiasm. Dr. Hartley specifically asked for you. She said your work on the schools demonstrated exactly the kind of practical intelligence and organizational skill they need. Catherine, I'm already managing 3 schools with 5 more in development. I have a family. You have a husband who supports your work completely and a small army of staff to help manage the household. Eleanor, you've proven you can do this. More importantly, you've proven you should do this. Don't let fear of overextension keep you from opportunities. It was an echo of what Adrian had said to her in the flooded castle about not letting fear keep her in a cage. Eleanor smiled at the memory. Let me discuss it with Adrian. If he's comfortable with the additional commitment, then yes, I'm interested. He'll be thrilled. You know he will. Catherine settled into a chair, her expression softening. You've changed, you know. Not just in circumstances, but fundamentally. You're more confident, more willing to claim your place in the world. I had good teachers, Eleanor said. You and Adrian showed me that intelligence and ambition aren't character flaws to be hidden, but gifts to be used. We simply provided the opportunity. You did the rest. Catherine paused, then added with uncharacteristic seriousness, I'm proud of you, Eleanor, and I'm grateful that my brother had the sense to recognize what he'd found. Before Eleanor could respond, Adrian and William burst into the room, both slightly muddy and entirely pleased with themselves. We found frogs, William announced with the triumph of a great explorer. Papa says they're important for the ecosystem. Papa is correct, Eleanor said, trying to maintain a stern expression despite her amusement. But Papa and William both need to wash before tea. A minor detail, Adrian said, grinning. He caught Eleanor's eye, and something in his expression told her he'd been listening at the door. Catherine's proposal sounds fascinating. We should discuss it properly after this young naturalist has been cleaned up. That evening, after William had been put to bed and Catherine had retired to her rooms, Eleanor and Adrian sat in the library, the comfortable silence of long companionship settling around them. You want to do it? Adrian said. It wasn't a question. I do. But it's a significant commitment, and I don't want to neglect. You won't neglect anything. Eleanor, you're one of the most organized people I know. If you want to take on the hospital project, we'll make it work. He reached for her hand. I married you knowing you were ambitious and brilliant. I'm not going to suddenly expect you to limit yourself because it's more convenient. Some would say a duchess should focus on managing the household and hosting dinners. Some are idiots. You're not some duchess. You're my duchess, and that means you get to define the role however you choose. He pulled her closer. Besides, I find your ambition remarkably attractive. It would be a shame to waste it on menu planning. Eleanor laughed, leaning into his embrace. You're biased. Completely, but also correct. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Take on the hospital project. Change the world. I'll be here, supporting you and managing our son's frog collection. It's a good life, isn't it? Eleanor said softly. Not perfect, but good. Real. It's an extraordinary life, and it's ours. Later, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she found herself thinking about the woman she had been in that flooded castle. Desperate, uncertain, trapped by circumstances she couldn't control. That woman had been offered a choice, and she had been brave enough to take it. Everything that followed, the work, the love, the life she was building, had grown from that single moment of courage. She thought about the girls in the schools she'd helped establish, about the future women physicians who would train at the hospital Catherine wanted to support, about William growing up in a world where intelligence and ambition were celebrated rather than suppressed. She thought about all the women still trapped in golden cages, waiting for someone to offer them a choice. And she resolved to keep opening doors, to keep creating opportunities, to keep proving that women could be more than decorative additions to men's lives. Not because she had all the answers, but because she had learned that change began with people brave enough to try. Adrian joined her at the window, slipping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About floods," Eleanor said. "About how sometimes the things that seem like disasters turn out to be the best things that could have happened." "Philosophical tonight, are we?" "Grateful," Eleanor corrected. "Grateful for floods and dukes and sisters-in-law who refuse to accept limitations. Grateful for second chances and the courage to take them." "I'm grateful too," Adrian said quietly. "For stubborn widows who refuse to be diminished, for conversations that matter, for a life that's messy and complicated and infinitely better than the sterile perfection I was supposed to want." They stood together in the window, watching the stars emerge over the Derbyshire hills. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and built something remarkable from the wreckage of their old lives. The flood had passed, but its effects remained, not as destruction but as transformation. Eleanor had learned to bloom where she was planted, and in doing so had discovered that she could plant herself anywhere she chose. That was the real gift, not rescue, but the realization that she had always possessed the strength to save herself. She simply needed someone to believe in her enough to prove it. And now, standing in her own home, with work she loved and a family she'd chosen, Eleanor Ashford, now Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Thornbury, knew that she had finally found what she'd been searching for all along, not security or status, but the freedom to be fully, authentically herself. The rest, as they say, was just the beginning. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. Your support means everything, and I'd love to know how far this story has traveled. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest transformations come from the most unexpected circumstances.